Hello everyone! Do you guys know what is cool? Iceberg charts. The idea of the iceberg chart is based on the sentiment that you only ever see 10% of the iceberg above the water, and there is some crazy unknowable number beneath the water. So, with this PSO2 chart, as we move deeper, you go beneath the surface level and find quirks about the game that are less known or talked about. This chart was provided by Matoi, and I didn't see anyone cover it, so it's a perfect opportunity to talk about some obscure PSO2 history most global players couldn't even imagine. Wait! No! That's wrong! Get that slander out of here! Anyway, let's dive in. This refers to the original weapons that weren't grinded through the EXP system we know of today. These weapons wouldn't show up in Global until the release of challenge quests. Here is a fun piece of trivia. Old-type weapons weren't officially called old-type until they were added to Global. On JP, old-type weapons kept their regular name, and if the same weapon was re-released as new type, it would simply have NT at the end of the name. Boy oh boy, I'm surprised these were even a thing. Originally, Ranger's Blight rounds boosted damage by 300%. Yes, you heard me correctly, it quadrupled party damage. Around the time Episode 3 was about to launch, the devs wisened up a bit and rebalanced Ranger a little. Unfortunately, they only reduced it to 255%, so the issue was barely even addressed. In Episode 4, the devs implemented Blight round jamming. Jammed Blight rounds turned blue and only boosted damage by 20%. Sometime during Episode 5, SEGA finally stopped beating around the bush. They nerfed Blight rounds to 20% for all content, removing the jamming mechanic in the process. I mean, do I even have to elaborate? You grab your UQ loot, turn it into X cubes, then go to the X cube exchange and turn it all into grinders. You can then sell those grinders and make some decent pocket money. I'm pretty sure everyone knows about this trick, if you can even call it that. Now, when the global version originally launched, the name for the Raven weapon series was Slave-like in the JP original. With the weapon series being dark-colored, it obviously didn't send good vibes, so it was quickly changed. And honestly, Ravens are cool as heck. It's a good name. I mentioned this in my recap series when it came up, but originally, for about half a year of the game's launch, there was neither an X-Cube system nor an overlevel mechanic. And even once they were implemented, if you forgot to unlock your level cap, something we on Global didn't have to deal with, you could potentially lose out on a crap ton of EXP. Scion classes were most notorious about that, since they had individual level caps. This is also something I recently covered in my recap series. Unfortunately, I can't find a source that tracked the original values. But I do remember that if you didn't have a level 16 or above PA levels, you were dealing a lot less damage. They do. If you want to experience that, go ahead and let the launcher-wielding Goldradas hit you with their Blight rounds. I only recommend that for masochists though. I'm pretty sure most Summoner players should be familiar with the Marin Revolver. In many, if not most, fights this is the preferred strategy to dispose of enemies. Just let Marin absorb enough attacks, throw it, it dies, and deals a lot of damage. Swap to the next one, repeat. By the time you get to the 6th one, the first one should be back on its feet. Old-type weapon upgrading was really bad. Basically, when grinding a OT weapon, your grind level could increase by 1, stay the same or D-level. The D-level part was especially funny, because it could D-level by as much as 3 levels at a time. The upgrade rate for 12-star weapons was so bad in fact, that the rates for 13-star weapons were higher. Otherwise, people would riot about wasting their precious new Lambda grinders. This refers to a strategy where Bravers and Hunters use Gunner's Chain Trigger skill to amplify the damage of Vokraptor and Banish Arrow. In case you don't know, these PAs would essentially absorb the damage you deal with other PA, and then deal bonus damage depending on how much damage was absorbed. So, not only would your PAs be boosted, the recorded damage from those PAs was boosted as well. This ended up melting Magatsu like crazy and marked one of the many reasons why Gunner's skills are on such a tight main class only leash. Speaking of main class only, Chain Finish used to be usable by subclasses, but things weren't meant to be. Summoners abused the living crap out of it. Here, let me play this footage in full to demonstrate the issue. Yes, that was a full Dark Falls Mother UQ, back when it was relevant content, cleared in under a minute. SEGA still has PTSD from this. This involved using the new Ricoteri bow, which had Tech ATK on it. You'd use the previously mentioned Banish Arrow PA with techniques. But Kathy, why not just use bow PA on a regular Braver? Well, Precision Stance requires you to hit weak points for it to work. However, matching elemental weakness with techniques counts as hitting a weak point, even if you're not hitting one. Elision was a very cool wand that we on Global unfortunately never received. Elision boosted the damage of uncharged techniques by a whopping 70%. Turbulent Sazon boosted the damage in exchange for extending the charge time. But if you skip the charge time altogether, you end up reaping all the benefits without any negatives. I already talked about Blight Round jamming, so I don't think I need to explain further. It's a forgotten relic of episode 4. So, many of you might not know this, but PSO2, before it got released globally, had an official English release in Southeast Asia. That version had some exclusive content and the Tagboard series units were one of them. Eventually, the servers for the SEA version shut down, and the units were released in the JP version over the course of episode 5. These theories refer to people assuming Xeno was Persona, purely based on the stats the Persona Soul Augment provides. Xeno is canonically better with ranged weapons after all. This theory might look silly in retrospect. Keep in mind that the player character didn't wield the Coded Edge sword in cutscenes, so initially the connection was harder to make. Okay, we're starting to get into some deep waters here. This weapon potential was part of the Zynesis series, and was meant to help you augment the weapon. Unfortunately, this skill didn't work server-side at first, causing people to fail augment attempts that were displayed with a 100% success rate. SEGA wanted to compensate for that bug, but we will get to that later. Okay, so, when expert matching was first introduced, it wasn't done with a filter you apply at the quest counter. Instead, you'd have separate blocks dedicated just for expert players. Needless to say, this only contributed to splitting the player base. When episode 5 rolled around, expert blocks were removed and replaced by the previously mentioned filter option. Now, this skill should preserve your loaded bullets when using different weapons. Ranger has access to 3 weapons by default after all. Unfortunately, this skill only works with rifle and launcher. So let's say you play Ranger Luster, and you want to use the Gunblade and swap into Rifle to apply Blight rounds. Because this skill only covers Rifle and Launcher, the moment you swap into Gunblade, the remaining Blight rounds are lost. So, this refers to seasonal urgent quests before they had a teleporter at the start of the quest. Basically, Gal Griffin had really good drop rates, so having 12 people searching for one in 12 different instances was far more efficient than playing this UQ normally. To combat this, SEGA completely redesigned seasonal urgent quests. Now, after you finish the countdown at the teleporter, nobody can enter your instance anymore. I don't have a source on this, so I can only go off memory. Originally, the plan for episode 5 was to not have any free field exploration map at all. Instead, the plan was to focus entirely on Buster quests. The story quests were Buster quests. The main mode to receive new weapons and fight new enemies was Buster quests. New campaigns? Buster quests. People really didn't like this, first because BQs were poorly designed initially, having a stamina system that only allowed 3 main matches before forcing you into a free match to recover it. Secondly, this game mode was heavily designed around Hero, the new class. Other classes just couldn't keep up, due to being clunky, or having too many conditional damage multipliers. Originally it was intended for there to be several Buster Quest maps, and each kingdom having their own flavor of Buster Quests. In order to appease the player base, SEGA dropped most development of Buster Quest content and focused on the Enchanted Forest free field exploration. Story quests also stopped being Buster Quests and resumed being solo missions again. So, if I remember correctly, this wasn't necessarily a super good strategy to make your friend partners deal decent damage. It was mostly just a visual annoyance, because back in the day we couldn't reduce the attack visuals of other players. Ilfoy is a very big explosion, so having several friend partners spam that technique got annoying really quickly. This is another relic of the past. Quests had higher entry requirements than they do these days. I think at some point it was replaced with an EXP penalty that hit the entire party. Unfortunately, I don't remember if there was more to this system than that. Believe it or not, the double jump ability was Jet Boots and Hero exclusive until spring 2018. Prior to that, you had to use all class Jet Boots, which ate up a weapon palette slot. But hey, anything for those sweet time attack speedruns, am I right? So, this is something I'm not 100% sure about, because it's not archived. If I understand it correctly, guard stance used to only boost melee defense. During episode 2, that was changed from melee defense to melee damage reduction, supposedly to make guard stance stronger. I guess SEGA wasn't really great at math though. Back in the day we were dealing with lower stats overall, and the melee defense stats actually negated more damage than a damage reduction it was replaced with. SEGA did later buff guard stance, by re-implementing melee defense, and boosting the damage reduction a bit further. Basically, a hacker would teleport NPCs around the lobby and people wouldn't be able to complete their client orders when playing on that block. This is one of many instances of hackers pissing into our monomates. You thought we were done exploiting Gunner? Foolish! This skill is what caused the magical Gunner legends. What you'd do is equip TMG with tech on them, use a stylish roll, and then chain it together with a really strong technique. Not even current subclasses provide this much power for tech users. Honestly, I'm not sure I need to explain this one. This PA was just oxymoronic every step of the way. Ranger has a lot of boosts that only apply when standing still. This PA makes you slide forward. Not only that, but you also want to stay at a certain distance to deal extra damage. This PA closes the gap. And if that's not bad enough, most potency is backloaded to the final kick, which doesn't even deal range damage. It deals striking damage. So a lot of your modifiers didn't apply anyway. And you weren't even safe while doing so. Who made this PA? I need to talk to them and ask what they were thinking. Maybe they'll help me figure out why Tector was so mishandled. I'll just let the footage roll. Keep in mind, back in the day, running normally was much slower than it is today. I assume SEGA didn't want to bloat the menus with redundant difficulties, but remember how I mentioned that you had to be within 5 levels of a quest? This basically meant that you had to be level 29 just to enter. And the highest normal free field had level 16 mobs. So, this is also something I mentioned in my recap series. Augmenting was even harder than it is now, because you were limited to just 2 fodder items. This is why the Meseta costs spike so much the moment you select a 3rd fodder item. The fodder limit was increased to 5 around the time SEGA implemented Astral Soul, at the end of episode 3. After that, each episode would have its own compound augment. Even NGS. Now, I don't remember how exactly you got them originally. It was probably tied to client orders. Getting only 11 Lambda grinders weekly meant that you only had 11 attempts at grinding your 13-star weapon. You needed at least 40 to max one out. This made grinding OT 13-star weapons an absolute nightmare, despite having better rates than 12-star weapons. As soon as we got NT weapons, we began preparing 12-star fodder items to grind 13-star weapons in as few steps as possible. So, this is a very simple programming oversight, and it's kinda interesting that it happened to begin with. The Dark Falls Elder UQ is split in 2 phases, one where you defeat as many Falls arms as possible, and one where you defeat Elder's main body. If you didn't participate in Phase 1, you were not eligible for Phase 2. So, you'd have one guy opening a fresh instance of Falls arms, and lock it with a password. Everyone else clears Elder normally, then everyone hops over to the Falls arms room. After clearing Falls arms, Phase 2 refreshed and allowed you to clear Elder again. So, this was an issue I briefly mentioned in my recap series. Until August 2014, Krothos client orders were daily and you needed to clear each time attack quest once, on each difficulty, except super hard. This was an insane amount of money on a daily basis, especially since client orders are per character, so the more the merrier. I'm not exactly sure why Ranger is singled out here, but this was a quirk of PSO2 back in the day. Only Hunter, Ranger and Force were available on character creation, and if you wanted to play Fighter, you needed to play Hunter first. Same for the other classes. I think the exact level needed was 30. Because of some spaghetti coding, this is probably why we never received the ability to start PSO2 on a fresh character as either Fighter, Gunner, or Tector. At least not until NGS. So, this is a bit of a teaser for my upcoming history of PSO2 Tector video. Believe it or not, Territory Burst used to eat up 10 skill points and it was an active ability too. There is still a remnant of that in the current skill tree. Territory Burst PP Save's skill description says, during Territory Burst, as if it was still an active ability. As for why one of Tector's most important tools needed to be temporary, don't ask me. Tector in PSO2 was just a perpetual tragedy. In PSO2 IRL fan meetups, SEGA always includes whiteboards representing each ship. Players from those ships usually gather around and write messages on them. In the IRL meetup episode of PSO2 Comic, the board for Ship 2 was very underrepresented to say the least. This is probably the first time an official source from SEGA acknowledged how populated Ship 2 was with overseas players, who naturally wouldn't be able to attend an offline event like that. It's a little known fact, but depending on your race and class you'd have very different stats. A male cast for example doesn't have as much tech power as a female Newman. This does add up, and while you can control the class you play, you couldn't race swap. The requirements for 10-star units were so stingy that you were locked into whatever stats you could barely achieve with your race. This is purely just a bad player choices thing. Element is something you had to manually boost to 60. You were supposed to do this with at least one weapon required to build Atlas or Ophistia. If you didn't do that, you either had to sacrifice weapons of the same rarity and category in order to upgrade 1% at a time, or just dismantle the weapon entirely and start fresh. So, you know how hard it can be to spawn a Vegas Illusia for the Las Vegas daily orders? Now, imagine that after several instances, you finally get one. Unfortunately, it's the rare version and it doesn't count for the daily. Funny joke, SEGA. I don't remember when this was changed, but just the thought of that situation is enough to boil my blood. Speaking of boiling blood, we've reached the depths of the Dudu Tier. And fittingly enough, the first point is about upgrading weapon elements. Upgrading weapon elements these days is pretty easy. As long as the fodder weapon had the same rarity and weapon category, you'd grind the element by either 1%, 10%, or the elemental value of the fodder item. Prior to September 4, 2013, this wasn't the case. Originally, the fodder weapon had to have the same name as the weapon you were grinding, and would boost the element by a minuscule amount. Elemental grinding also used synthesizers. These days, synthesizers serve no purpose outside being a currency at the pet lab. Now, if you play on JP servers, you might still find these consumable items on the player shop. Basically, skills like Upper Trap originally required consumable items, which you could buy in the camp ship. There is not much really to say about this, other than Ranger players had more inventory bloat than should be considered legal. So, this was something that has only been a thing for 2 whole days. On October 10, 2013, PSO2 received its first major update. Part of that update was the level cap increase from 40 to 50. However, a few people quickly realized that the EXP bar wasn't progressing all too quickly. In fact, in order to level up from 40 to 50 you needed 173 million EXP. Back in the day that was a ridiculous amount of EXP. These days, in order to level from 95 to 100, you only need 89 million EXP. Almost half of what was originally needed for level 40 to 50. SEGA changed the required EXP to 31 million, which was much more appropriate for the time. This isn't well archived and Mill actually misremembered that part a little bit. In older versions of the game you had to collect 30 area drops per planet in order to increase your level cap from 30 to 40. This was eventually changed to 10 area drops, and on global it was removed altogether. So, remember when I talked about the oopsie where augmentation guidance wouldn't work properly? As an apology, SEGA originally wanted to give an augmentation aid item, which would boost the success rate by 100%. People justifiably told SEGA that this is a terrible idea. An item like that is way too strong to implement, and SEGA listened. Speaking of things that are way too strong and SEGA listening to fan feedback. Originally when the Famitsu magazine teased Talus Tech Bonus, it was listed as increasing potency of techniques casted from deployed Talus by 50%. I probably don't need to tell you, but that's a ridiculous boost over casting techniques from a rod. Players swiftly requested it to be nerfed. Eventually, when the skill hit live servers, it was released with a potency increase of 20%, making it probably the first skill to ever be nerfed prior to even releasing. That one is unfortunately not archived. But I vividly remember that if you wanted to do the skill point client orders, you had to use all of your available weapons. On Hunter for example it meant using sword on one enemy, partisan on a different enemy, and wired lance on another enemy. Unfortunately, I don't remember the multiple kills part, and neither SWiki nor Cernopedia have it archived. So, this is as best as I can explain it myself. Have you ever heard of the tragedy of Belk Welker, the chain finalist? I thought not. It's not a story the devs would tell you. Belk Welker is a 10-star wired lance, which boosted the effective chain finish by 20%. You might already see some design issues with that, but keep in mind that back when this weapon first released, neither chain trigger nor chain finish was exclusive to main class or TMG yet. Unfortunately, due to various exploits we've discussed throughout this video, chain trigger would be put on lockdown to prevent any further exploits. Belk Welker isn't equipable by gunner, and even if it was, chain finish only works on TMG these days. This is truly a relic of a foregone era. Now, what could be so ominous about a simple test message? Well, that was a hacking thing too. The hacker whispered everyone on the ship at once with a simple test message, and personal shops would go down completely. It happened so often, that at that year's IRL meetup event, someone wrote test on the ship 2 whiteboard, referring to these hacking incidents. And of course, the entire venue shut down immediately. Very tragic. And that's about it. We've reached the bottom of the iceberg. All in all, I must say this iceberg had a lot of fun stories about the game. I didn't know about a few of them, since I've been playing on and off till about episode 5. But, despite this I hope I did a good job at explaining some of the lesser known and obscure things about the game. Global players missed out on so much. As mentioned in the beginning, this iceberg was created by Mil Martos. Feel free to follow them on Twitter and YouTube. They specialize in breaking down the math of New Genesis. If you need info on how the new weapon series performs, they're the person you need. I'll leave links to all their sites in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss out on any of my videos. I hope I'll see you in the next one. Take care!